was a time when the news halls were bright with watchful eyes, a cipher we could trust, a steady lamp against the lights. Ink on the fingers, truth.
Welcome to Emotional Algebra with Dr. E. I'm Andrew Tavani, your co-host.
And I'm Dr. E.
Dr. E, we are playing that song again. What does that mean?
Well, I think there was plenty to discuss on this topic after the last episode. We kind of talked, and with our awesome guests we're going to have on again about things that we really didn't get a chance to talk about. We felt were really critical to this discussion of what's been happening with our media, the fourth estate, as we talked about in the last episode, and talk about where can we go from here. So there's some definite important points to follow.
Absolutely. We had a great discussion on the last episode, and in fact, we just kind of ran out of time. There's so much more to cover. We are going to welcome our esteemed guest from that episode back, Jim Proeller. Here he is. Welcome back to Emotional Algebra with Dr. E. Jim. Good to see you again.
Good to see you guys. Yeah, we had a lot to talk about, and there's certainly, so much to go back and forth on in different perspectives. So I look forward to carrying on the conversation.
And I think emotionally, since again, it's such an important piece to talk about, especially today, because there's so much anxiety around what's happening and what to trust. And, years ago for one of the daily dose of sunshines that I did for AccuWeather, that's where I met Andrew through, and Jim was a producer there. I did one about trust. Who do you trust and how do we know what to trust? So this has obviously been something that's been brewing for years. And if there were trust issues in 2020, there were trust issues long before that. And I think to me, that's I tell people in my work, one of the greatest gifts I can be given and anybody can be given is trust. Because when you have trust, there's safety, there's security, there's often feeling love, there's feeling understood, or at least that somebody will seek an honest understanding of you. So this is where I really feel like there's a struggle.
Yeah, no doubt. We talked about it in the last episode with that, with the Gallup poll that was taken at the beginning of October, showing that media trust in the media is at basically an all-time low over the last 53 years since they started taking that poll. So that's kind of the and we only just scratched the surface of that last time. So that's kind of, I guess, where we're going to take off from today.
And even the history, when we look back over 100 years just in our survey of history, it's waxed and waned over time. And I believe I brought that up the last episode too. But I think that what we want people to see is, yes, there is hope, and that hope depends on us. It depends on each of us and what we do with it. But we did want to kind of talk about what are the things that happened that affected for trust, and really follow up on that a little more in detail. And I think one of the things I wanted to bring attention to is how often when they're reading the news and it's going through the teleprompters, there are words that are in many ways trying to add to the drama of things. They want to use words like tragedy or extreme or unprecedented, or words like that. They have an effect on people. And when we realize that that's to keep us engaged, it affects our trust. When we realize that there are other things that are happening in the news and the way it's reported, that affects our trust. And I think that's where the media really wants to see how they can take responsibility for what they put out there, because it's not just about eyes on. You can get eyes on from anything. And I know there's the phrase bleed to lead. And that's a really important thing we have to look at too, is what they lead with in the news are things that are going to grab your attention that people feel like are emotive or emotionally evocative. And they want to get people hooked and pulled in with that. And then sometimes you find out that the headline wasn't really what the story was, or as extreme as the story wasn't extreme as the headline.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jim, I'm curious to hear your take on that. There's obviously, there's various types of media, right? You have television, you've got, and I think some of what you're talking about, like if it bleeds, it leads idea comes from back in like the tabloid newspaper era, like way back, going, back to like the New York Post and the Daily News and even whatever the papers were in the late 1800s in New York. And then now on the internet, it's, It's partly on social media, and we'll get to that too. But what do you think, Jim? There is a balance to strike there. You do want to be descriptive in the language you use. You want, I know you want to use like strong verbs and whatnot, but you also have to not go overboard, right?
Yeah, and it's those that are writing these stories, those that are producing these stories, they're human beings, and they get emotional usually, and they're as part of the story or seeing it firsthand, hopefully, so that they are sensing the story, and then they're reporting it, and they're feeling passionate or very impacted by what we see, and then you might come up with those extreme verbs and look at something as unprecedented or very difficult and challenging to see and watch and be a part of. So it's important, I believe, that when we're doing those stories, we have a number of gatekeepers. Not only is a reporter doing the story, but he or she has a copy editor. In television, you often have a producer, and then there's more people involved too as well. So when you're discussing how you're going to put the story together, what words are you going to use, you want to make sure that you're not using hyperbole, not over and over again saying something that's so sensational that you're just trying to get a view, get a click. That's not what we should be after. What we should be after is actually portraying the story as it's actually happening, so that the viewer, the reader, can get the experience of what's taking place. We certainly don't want to be, so dry and be able to say something in just such an innocuous way that it doesn't give the viewer or the reader any kind of sense of what's taking place. But you don't need to be, overblown in your verbiage and your adjectives and saying stuff over and over again that really isn't giving you a full picture of what's taking place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And look, can I say one thing too here that I think a lot of people don't know? People watching at home have no idea, or reading at home, whatever. And Jim, I think for you, it's the television, like the headline in the lower third chyron, right? You have a limited amount of space to work with. For newspaper writers, they've got whatever, they might have 6 inches, or online it's even shorter in some cases, depending on where the headline's appearing. So there's all those challenges too, on top of what you're describing, just trying to be as interesting and as factual as possible going through. You've got these other sort of parameters that you're working within also.
Absolutely. And many of us subscribe to notifications from major news organizations. So when we get those notifications, whether it be on our phone, whether they be on our laptop, they're succinct, like you say, and they're produced in order to get our attention. So they, in order for their business to succeed, they need to have us clicking on those. But again, is it really over the top, and is it pulling us into something that we're not going to get? It's not going to back up what the headline is stating. Then that's irresponsible. That's something that should not be done. Certainly there are those moments, those times, they're unique, and they need to be presented as unique. But that doesn't mean every single story that comes to me is a notification. That comes to me, in different ways, alerting me to my news of the day, that it's over the top and pulling me in, because after a while, I'm going to be done.
That's such a great point, Jim. I actually think about the newspaper editors of just 40 years ago, right? Can you imagine that? And maybe some of them are still alive, retired at this point. But can you imagine how great it would have been for them to be able to just push a button and get somebody's attention instantly, rather than having to wait for the next morning for your newspaper to hit the stands on the next morning?
I guess their equivalent is the news crier on the corner,
Yes.
holding up the newspaper boy, extra, read all about it, whatever the headline is, and that's the notification of yesteryear.
Yeah.
But I think even one of the factors we look at what's affecting trust too is who's buying up these media outlets now.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some big sales recently, and there's a lot of fear out there that people are buying these newspapers are going to affect the editorial nature as well as what is reported, how it is reported. And that raises a lot of trust, as well as there's been years between the Fox versus the MSNBCs. I think those are kind of probably the two kind of biggest news outlets that people would say were definitely slanted towards a right or left viewpoint. That's where I think some of those news silos started coming from. And then the issues that I always ran into with CNN is CNN seemed to be slotted into more the left. And I think that's where then once people slot those in their mind and they put them in those boxes, then depending on which side they want to appeal or they want to align with, that's the side they're going to choose. And it doesn't matter to some degree what's true or not. It matters is, does that headline fall in with my belief system or my attitudes or my political views or even my religious views? And that's the things to me that are the biggest concern is that truth has been lost in some of these ways, or it's been manipulated in ways to align with somebody's belief system. And that's to me where the largest struggle comes from.
Yeah, and are we as consumers of news and information just wanting to be in an echo chamber and hear our own voice, trumpeted back to us, or do we want to actually, research, identify information from several different sides, several different sources, and then be able to, think through and challenge our thinking too from both sides or several sides, depending on the issue, and be able to come up with our own decision? Or are we just, looking to force feed ourselves with what we want to hear over and over again? So I think it's important. Sometimes we all naturally get caught up into that. And I think it's so important for us to step back and be able to say, okay, I need this. I need to research a little bit more, identify several different sources, and then come to my own conclusion, over a period of time, instead of snap judgments just by reading a headline or by, quickly identifying a source and say, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
That's so hard to do, though. Don't you think, just for the average person in America today? I feel like that is a very, especially with the amount of different media that, and we haven't gotten to it quite yet, but even with social media, it's sort of just amplifying the number of ways that you can get information out there. Mm-hmm. It's hard, right? It's like people work all day. They got stuff to do. They got kids. They got any number of commitments. And then to have to then go and be like, all right, and now I've got to do extra research. I feel like it's a lot to ask of people.
It is, but when we're making decisions or especially on important issues of the day, whether it be, in regard to the issues surrounding the government shutdown, issues around who to vote for, these are important things and important decisions as a human being, as an American, to make. And we have to think of our, I say responsibility as an individual, as in this country, to be able to make some informed decisions. That doesn't mean that, when I'm reading about the Philadelphia Eagles, that I might not, do my research and identify several different sources. I might be, or you might be biased in this regard. But, on very extremely important issues, I think it's key. But we have to educate the consumer on that too as well. And let them know and be transparent on the front end too, as to how what the news organization, whatever news organization is reporting this news, how did they get that information? Who did they talk to? What sources did they use? Where did they go? These are important components up front to be able to say, not start off by assumptions and direction of how the story is going, as much as where do we start from? And then allows the viewer to have a frame of reference and be able to start from there and say, okay, I now know what they're doing here, and now what's the issue, and what are some of the important components that'll help me identify how I feel about the story.
Right. And again, you're kind of sounds like in some of what you're talking about too is, how do you vet those news agencies? Who vets them? If you don't trust how that news was vetted, or who vetted that news as an agency as being qualified to report the news and working by those ethics and values, that to me are taught through a lot of those journalism courses, and how to really have that integrity to the story and truth to the story. I think that's some of what people are questioning every day. Is this just a mouthpiece, versus are they really seeking to speak the truth and speak truth to fear, speak truth to power? And that's what I think the struggle is if we look at what's happened, and it seems like in our country lately, is there are news organizations that almost seem to feel afraid to speak truth to power, because they feel afraid of what might come from that. And that creates decisions made beyond just editorial. It affects the financial decisions that affect the news source and the employees and those who are looking to make sure that their stock performs. So I think in that level, we have to look at the level at which that fear that people feel that affects even an organization like a corporation, because those decisions aren't made by the corporation. Those decisions are made from those who are running the corporation, who then that passes down to producers and to those who are writing stories. And I mean, would you agree with that, Jim?
Yeah, to some extent, it's certainly an influence, and I think it's the responsibility of management to be able to, in different layers of management, as it comes down to the actual people that are producing and reporting on the news, is to identify, okay, there are corporate goals, there are components to that, and how do we interpret those in corporate goals into our day-to-day reporting, day-to-day journalistic goals, for our news organization. And I think we have to, individuals, managers have to be clear on that to their staff, so that, they have a little bit of an understanding, or a lot of understanding of, where do they go to achieve, and how do they go about achieving, their goals towards reporting a story for the day. NBC's now doing an ad campaign where they use the words "clear facts," and I imagine what they're saying in regard to clear is that understanding up front where the information's coming from and how it's getting to you, along with ensuring that it's factual, and then identifying too, how did they determine it's factual. CNN, AP, others, use fact checkers now. With AP, I'd love to see, they have their fact checking information at the bottom as you scroll down. I'd rather see that up the top, and that doesn't mean that you have to use the whole, width of the screen in order to say this is our fact checking and start off with that. But I think that should be part of the main frame of view, so that you can understand on the important stories of the day, what are the facts and how were they checked, and to be transparent about that. And folks like Daniel Dale, who works for CNN and does a good job of laying out all the facts, and will lay out, what was confirmed as important information, why it was confirmed that way, and the same way when it's confusing, why it was confusing, and then also debunking facts, or debunking statements that aren't facts. So I think that clarity is so important, much more than ever. And when we understand that news organizations are doing that, and not up front, not saying debunk everything, but to be on the more important stories and what's being said on them by very important players, and prominent figures, those things have to be put into the story and or framed, in important sidebar components like fact checking.
Yeah, and I even think in terms of, you were talking about a lot of what's said, but even what people have seen is brought in questions on things like weather stories. I know you've had that unique experience, Jim, of being at CNN, at AccuWeather, at Weather Channel in your history, and having some of those situations come up where people went for the shot that was basically kind of showing maybe a more sensational side of what they were actually in. While it wasn't untrue to the story entirely, where and how they might have taken some of those shots, like the person standing in what looks like to be a couple feet of floodwaters, and they're just on a little slope where the street sign looks like it's only 3 feet, to go till it's hot. And yet there was a very steep hill that they were able to get that shot in, or, many other situations of threatening weather. So I guess in those situations, how do you manage some of those situations when you find out after the fact? Do you coach some of the cameramen and the reporters on making sure that what they're doing is accurate, or what happens?
I think when it's actually happening, you have to be, like I said before, transparent, and to use a word that NBC is using, clear in their facts and clear in reporting, to be able to say, I'm standing in this lower point of water or higher point of water, and around me there's several different levels of water, and maybe walk through the different ones if it's safe enough to do so. Or if you're in the middle of a strong hurricane and you're getting the winds, the rain, being pummeled, to be able to say, I'm outside in front of this building in this throughway, and there's strong winds coming through. My cameraman or camerawoman is behind the building in order to be able to frame the shot and stay safe. But we wanted to give you an indication of what it was like to be out on the street. I think those are important components to be, you want to convey the realism of what's taking place. You want to give folks a strong reference point to show them what's actually happening. But you also want to be, absolutely accurate and transparent in how you're getting that shot. And we would discuss afterwards, and especially, in editing, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right way to show it? And you can do so in a voiceover. You can reference where you're standing, and you can also, in the writing, be able to state it. So those are important ways to frame the story and not, still capture the components that are necessary to give you an indication of what's actually taking place and how strong or impactful something might be, but yet not over sensationalized just for the sake of something that grabs your eye or grabs your ear, grabs your attention.
Yeah, weather's an interesting subject to cover. I feel like it's very visual in some cases, right? And I think Dr. E, you're referring to, I think the image you're referring to is the Anderson Cooper one, when he's sort of maybe like chest deep in a puddle of water, and then there's somebody snapped a photo showing his camera guy or lighting guy just standing a few feet away, but in like ankle deep water, not if that,
Yeah.
Now, so that's a very dramatic visual representation of sort of, exaggerating, let's say, the story, right? Is that a fair term? Not every story out there has those kind of contours to it that it can be seen in such, so easily if it's captured that way. So
yeah, and I would imagine there's a balance for safety in doing the reporting, yet wanting to share, like I said, some of those stories in some areas are accurate to show, and it might not have been necessarily safe. Whereas I think it's important to report that, like Jim is saying, to report it, because whenever those situations happens, it's another notch, in undercutting the integrity of the news organization or of that reporter or of that story. And then we believe less and less because people don't like to feel like they've been duped. Betrayal is a huge emotion that undermines mistrust and the ability to trust in the future. And that's where I think, again, if you understand when you're reporting the power you have to create an ambiance or, about a story, or to create the whole feeling that you want to create, we continue to have fed in our culture more and more extreme experiences, whether it's in the news, whether it's in our social media, whether it's in the movies we see, that we continue to escalate what people find scary or exciting or intriguing. And when we do that, then it has to go to the next levels. And I think people who want to keep eyes on are aware of that. So therefore you get some of that manipulation. And I think our human experience has been it's sensationalized in many ways. And then when we do have these stories that really should command our attention that are out of the bounds of normal, it's like, happened again. And that to me is like the school shootings now. To me, it's just they don't even report them all because there's so many. And that is to me a degradation of our culture as a whole. That do we all share responsibility, as I said last time? Yes, we do. And the media, to me, in that role that they chose to take, has a huge responsibility in how they choose to report and what they do about that.
And it's interesting you bring up things like school shootings, or any kind of terrorist attack that's happening today and being discussed in the media, in the newsrooms, does this rise to the level of being told right now? Are there, dare we say, enough people injured, killed? What is the situation? And does it rise to the level of getting, a piece of airtime or a piece of, our website or social media alerts?
Yeah. If it bleeds, it leads, right, Jim?
Well,
some places that's true. Some places, yes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And
sorry to put you on the spot there. I mean,
instantly, certain folks would go, I just went from a frame of what I do, and so I reacted in that way. But it's those decisions you have to make on a daily basis sometimes, and it becomes very challenging, and that's why when we make decisions, try to involve as many people as possible from different backgrounds and different ages, to be able to say, as quickly as possible and reasonably quickly as possible, does this rise to the level of necessary reporting? And if we're going to report it, how do you think we should report it?
And it's a constantly moving target too, right? A school shooting on one slow news day might lead the news, but on a day where Trump and Putin are meeting and the government's shutting down and there's 5 other huge stories, it may not get the same amount of coverage, or at least like front page coverage, let's call it.
Very important point. And a school shooting that is, has low numbers, if you will, if you allow me that, may be told on a day after a major school shooting because it's another school shooting.
Right.
On a normal day, it may not be reported. So all these variables go into play when you're discussing, how you cover stories. But I'd like to go back to just, to talking about Anderson Cooper in that story, and related to how we frame, and almost literally, how we frame our news stories and report from the scene. Now, I think with those situations, whether it be live shots or whether it be editing footage when it comes in, to be able to give our audience a proper frame of reference. And what I mean by that is the establishing shot should be a wide shot to be able to show and give the audience perspective. I think that's so valuable, no matter what story we're actually telling. And, to be able to say, okay, here's where things are, in this case with Anderson, where he is in the water, where the cameraman is in the water, although if the camera was taking the video, then, but he'd be able to show other people that might be in the water, that might be, covered only up to their ankles, while he might be in the middle, covered up to his chest. And then be able to start off with Anderson and saying, I'm here in the middle of this street that has, different levels of flooding. And here's a point of reference where it's the deepest, and then begin to walk, or he can stay there and be able to say, as you can see, there's other levels around. The water has been moving from place to place, and then continue on with the story. But that allows, in our own minds, when we're watching this material, us to have a full picture of the story to begin with, and then go into the individual components of the story to get more specific information on what's taking place.
Mm-hmm. And I think what is a good point that you brought up, Jim, when you were talking about, my comment too, if it bleeds, it leads, you're like, well, I'm coming from my reference, and not every producer is Jim Proeller. Like I said, that's where Andrew and I really respect you, because of the way that you've approached the news and your history of how you've approached it, and making sure you do look at all those pieces and you weave more of the whole story rather than what might ping certain people's emotions and attention. And I want to definitely come back to that. And that, yes, that I could understand that would have taken you back, ping some of that emotion, like, well, that's not the way I do it. And I'm glad you clarified that, because, producers are different in their choices and how they do that. And I think that understanding that it's not always even the news organization. Sometimes it is a producer that makes a call. And there's so many factors that go into the shots we see, the stories that are told, the copy that is read on the teleprompters, et cetera.
And that's an important point I want to jump off of on Dr. E is that that there are a lot of people involved at most reputable news organizations. There are a significant amount of people involved. And I know when Andrew and I worked together on different stories when we worked at AccuWeather, we would contact each other immediately and start talking through a story, and then how we're going to frame the story, what components of the story are we going to include, and then just discuss back and forth and debate, and then come up with some decisions. And then also involve others too that were editing the story, that were writing the story, and be able to get different perspectives, and then be able to, once the story is produced, whether it be in video and or text and still pictures, to be able then to look at it again and say, okay, did it come out the way that we discussed? Are there things that we're concerned about? And there are a lot of people involved in this and a lot of steps along the way. And I sometimes feel that so many viewers, readers, digesters of information are just saying, well, that person, one, did, reported X, and just put it out there as such, whether it be a web article, whether it be a news package, there are a significant number of people and involved in not only the production of that, but the assessment of the production to ensure that its integrity is intact.
Yeah, and there are competing interests too at times within an organization, depending on the type of organization you're at, and so that's all hashed out behind the scenes too. And like Jim said, you try to get a consensus with a bunch of people there that hopefully, one competing interest isn't given so much greater weight over another that it, would kind of sully the, how it made it to air or made it to a website or into print.
And I think this is a good segue into the effect of social media, because you have a lot of these people who are reporting their own versions of the news and their own news, and they're coming with their own stories, and they don't have the editorial oversight. They don't have maybe more than one other person helping to come up with, and they have their camera set up and they'll run with something very quickly and put it up there. And what was the stat that you found, Andrew, about?
Yeah, well, this actually Jim found this one. This is from Pew Research Center, and this was in late September of this year. Found that 72% of Americans get some amount of their news from social media, and 43% of adults under the age of 30 said they regularly get news from TikTok. And so it's unclear to me what that means when they say get news. It could be like Jim said, it could be them following NBC News on TikTok, which is pretty active on TikTok, or any other news organization. But it also could just be any random person who's doing the news.
Yeah. And that is a concern, because if you like the person and, they have 1.7 million, followers. I've just had somebody recently, 1.7 million followers. And the guy just, it seems like confabulation of some things and a lot of exaggeration, sensationalism to feed on people's fears and what they want to believe, what they want to call truth. And I'd love to see the sources. I'd love to see where this person's getting all their information. And so many other people who want to do the job, they don't do all the work to do the job, to me, to do it sufficiently for the role that they play in society. And I think that that's very dangerous.
I think another thing too, we didn't really talk about this before, but what happens out there is a lot of people will will go, and I've seen this, they'll go on social media and they'll just read you excerpts of the news from a mainstream media outlet, right? And they'll what they're doing essentially is aggregation, but they often don't they don't credit the source that they're reading from. They're just reading and essentially stealing the content. And then they're not even providing any path back to it so that at least the originator of that content can, monetize it essentially. So I feel like there's a lot of that going on, and that is not a new problem. I think it's a new form of the problem with like TikTok and some of the videos that you see. I even see it on Twitter sometimes. Going back like 10, 15 years, this was these new upstart media properties. Like I'll speak from experience. One was the Huffington Post at the time. One of the huge knocks against the Huffington Post was they weren't doing any original reporting. They were just taking a couple paragraphs from the New York Times and rewriting it, a couple paragraphs from the Washington Post, a couple paragraphs from the Wall Street Journal, all on the same story, putting it together, repackaging it, and putting it on a website. And they got criticized a lot for that, and maybe rightly so in some cases. Maybe not. I think that the model has really changed where aggregation has become very accepted at this point, but there's certain rules that you got to follow. Otherwise, you come too close to plagiarism.
It is so important for news organizations to clarify when they go from actual news reporting to any kind of commentary or opinion. So often, news networks now have a roundtable, and those things need to be said as such, that they're contributors who are giving their opinions and thoughts related to whatever it is that's going on in the news. And news organizations, the moderator of that program has a responsibility to ensure that the questions are framed properly, cleanly, and appropriately to each person, and that each side is given an appropriate amount of time and opportunity to go ahead and give their perspective, and then to have a good back and forth between all those. I think they're extremely beneficial if carried out correctly. To be able to give the viewer an understanding of the different sides. So, you can hear it, you can sense it, you can hear the questions being asked, and then you can be able to hopefully come up with your own opinion, or have enough to go on to be able to research and get more information to come up with your own opinion. I think CNN's Abby Phillip does a tremendous job on this on her program, where she has some very strong folks from the right and the left, and has a very hearty discussion, and she's able to moderate it effectively, with facts and with respect. And so I believe that those kind of opportunities give the viewer a foundation to be able to formulate their own decision making.
Right. And, I think on this discussion, we're getting to the point of another segue to the ultimate aggregator, which is AI. That when we go and we go check on something and we want to say, what happened in this experience or this thing, we still don't necessarily know where they pulled that data from. So I know some of the chatbot or some of the AI programs are now listing references where they got the news from. Or I always ask, what are your references on things? I also know that in having some discussions, just the voice chat between me and AI, that AI was very slanted. And I actually had a discussion with the AI bot to say, do you understand where you get your news from? Well, I just collect the facts. Well, you realize you're programmed by a human, right? Well, yes. Well, do you think humans can be biased? Yes, they can be biased. So do you think your program could be biased from what news you scrape and how you report that news? Because what you reported was not what I asked. What you reported was additional to that and sensationalized this whole other story that had nothing to do with what I said. And the AI actually said, you're right. I'll do better next time. Now, will it do better next time? Did I educate the programming of that AI? But probably not. Whereas I think, again, we have to keep in mind, AI is programmed by humans. What it might be taught to look at for sources of data, news, facts is going to be skewed by those who program that AI. We have to realize that to even trust AI, 2 different AI bots if you want to, and see if the information converges on each other, because there's so many people who just blindly want to trust and accept it as news, accept it as fact, especially if they believe in it, and not even looking at what is the slant, what is the angle of the individuals who program those chatbots.
Yeah, exactly. We have to look at it as another source, and be careful that it's not, we're not hearing our own source, our personal sources coming back to us, in another echo chamber style. That's a concern of mine too as well. But I think it's extremely valuable. I think there's so many things that AI can benefit in regard to reporting, in regard to writing, but it isn't the end all. It isn't the all by any means, right? It is a tool, to allow you to get some information, cross-check information, and have a few different stepping stones towards some greater information that you can utilize when you're putting together a story, when you're looking for information. But it isn't, it has to be verified, has to be, and news organizations, anybody who uses it, again, using our word that's been, used throughout our 2 podcast episodes is transparency. To be able to say how you used it, when it was used, what it was used for in relation to the story, and have that not scroll all the way to the bottom and see it in small print, but more up the top and in a reference to how the story was told and how was AI used. Yeah.
And even like we used to write term papers, we used to have those the references in there that we'd put in parentheses, and then you'd have the list of references at the end. But I would even think that, if AI is reading it to you, say, well, this source of news said this, and this source of news said this, why it's going through the story, to at least give you that right live. I think that's an excellent suggestion that I think would be helpful for a lot of people, just to understand, again, what are the points of aggregation, and can I trust all those sources myself? So this is a really critical time we're looking at, in our history, and in an inflection point in history, and where do we, in our future, and where do we go from here? Because we are creating the world for our children and their children. And if we don't realize the implications of some of these choices that we make, then what are we leading our kids toward? And how are we fostering their desire to really do the research, to check facts? As I talk about, from when my daughter was little, I always had her check her sources and have at least 2 sources. But there's a lot of situations where that's not happening. And AI is becoming more accepted in doing homework and research and all those pieces, that the ability to do that real intense background research, I think that's a skill that's going to be lost. And therefore, it makes us more susceptible to fake news and to manipulation and to not really questioning ourselves. That lets us be led down that path towards we're good, is what my concern is, as well as potentially, yes, it has an ability for good. Whereas I just really think we want to teach our kids the skill sets that are going to help them for the rest of their lives, not the rest of ours.
Well, you talk about AI and aggregation. And one thing that scares me with this is that, I've used some AI, and I don't like first of all, let me just say, I don't like the idea of using AI to get your news from, right? I think you should actually go and read the story, watch the stuff, because it will cite the sources. Like I'll search something and it'll say that it just read through 12 different stories on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one thing.
Don't you?
What's that?
Did you have to ask for that? I know. I think
no.
started listing him at the bottom.
It doesn't.
No, it comes up right. The link is attached to the statement usually, right?
Yeah. It's like, and there's like a little list of all the things. Now, I can read through the summary that it comes up with, which I've done, and how many times. And I as somebody who's pretty into the news, I'm kind of a news junkie. How many times did I actually click through to any of those? 0. Okay. And I don't use this, but just testing it out and then trying it, 0. So I doubt that the regular average news consumer is clicking through to that. So 2 things that I see as a problem there. One, is it summary? How accurate is the summary that it just gave me? And how do I know that it didn't, even if it has all the best intentions and intends to be accurate, how do I know that it just didn't leave out an important detail? So there's that. Then secondly, from the news business side of it, it's absolutely destroying the business model, right? Because it's just going and scraping through all those stories. I didn't click through to any of that, so they're not able to monetize it with an ad or a display ad or maybe a video ad or something. That's killing the news business. And frankly, I'd rather, whatever your criticisms of the mainstream media may be, I know some people have a lot of them, I'd rather have them there than having just AI do the news all on its own someday after it stomps out all the news business, all the news outlets through this sort of stuff. So that bothers me about it. I don't like that. I feel like, and maybe that'll be addressed at some point by the AI makers. I know that places like the New York Times have fought it hard about letting AI use the content, scrape the content and whatnot. Legally, they fought it, in court. But I think that's a huge threat to just the media's existence in the future.
Yeah. And just decreasing the number of humans that touch that information data. Like Jim was saying, they have their whole board of editorial board, that people that meet and talk about the stories and what did they do this? And like we talked about last time, CNN has the row that's responsible for verifying content and calling people and letting them know when they can release the information and how it's presented. So I think we have to, you're absolutely right, Andrew. And I think that's a major concern. I'm sure Jim is, even though you've been doing this for so long and might be looking at when you make your exit from your career, but what are your concerns about the future of the media and of the people who consume it?
Yeah, it's a troubling time, and you look at the huge reduction in newspapers, local news, which I think local newspapers and local news is really where it all starts. Most people tend to trust what happens in their own backyard more, and and those are going away. So that makes it very difficult for anything in that business to stay alive. So it's with AI taking away jobs and responsibilities and key and core responsibilities to news organizations, I think it's very, very troubling. As we get into machine learning and more machine learning and machine learning from machine learning, and all that stuff grows and grows, and then reduces the amount of human beings' thought that's involved into it, brains that are involved into it. That's really concerning. So, it's troubling to our business in the sense of, less of us out there, less of us doing the job, and not really moving in the best direction, because AI isn't, the end all catch all for accuracy, right? So, we're reducing the amount of humans involved to fact check and to ensure that things are correct and done in the best way possible. But yet we're increasing the amount of information that comes from, something like AI, which we, can't really verify effectively, without a lot of research and time. So, it's scary all around, not just in the content, but in the business of personnel and keeping our businesses running. The only thing that business-wise is are the companies involved in such as AI and major servers and stuff like that. So and possibly the security around them, but so.
So I know that you had brought up a couple articles of news sources that are changing their approach and trying to, as we move forward in the future, and really try to restore trust. That seems to be a new emergence from what we know. So what were those sources that you had found, Jim?
Well, Reuters has just recently, rebranded some of their their mission statement, and I was mentioning NBC earlier today. They have a new ad campaign that started last week, and going into America and identifying what most Americans are concerned about, getting facts, getting them cleanly, and being able to trust their sources. So, these news organizations are recognizing that they have to go back to basics in order to regain or even, reestablish the trust necessary in order for their businesses to succeed. So they're going back to, their consumers and saying, here's what we're doing in a very, their ad campaigns and their message is very clean and clear as far as, we've heard you, America. We know you're concerned. So they're establishing that fact out front. Yes, we know you don't trust news.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's what we're doing. This is what we heard from you in regard to that trust, your concerns. Mm-hmm. And here's what we're doing specifically, to begin growing that trust again. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully standing behind it too as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be a good time and to be absolutely transparent in that way, to say, we realize over the years there has been a great shift and change in the way that news has been sourced, who reports it, how it reports it. We understand that over time that the words that we may have used may have been to evoke emotion. The way we reported the stories may have been to evoke emotion. And that over time we recognize factors that slowly chipped away at your trust with us. And through these times of change, this is our time to shift. And we realize that if you can't trust your sources of news, and news is a center point of our culture, and as we look back at the concept of the fourth estate and who we are and what we were originally tasked to do, we've tripped a few times and we've stumbled a few times, and now it's time for us to find our footing. How do you think something like that might go across with the public at large? From both of you guys, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important for news organizations to reestablish themselves like that, to be able to say, anytime that you acknowledge that you've made mistakes, that you recognize that you made mistakes, and that you're doing something about them, and then showing the audience and discussing with the audience what it is that you're doing to improve your accuracy, improve the way you're reporting on your stories. Those things are important to reestablish a relationship with the audience that's going to build, hopefully, trust over time. How to do that and when to do that is going to be key, because, can't start off every piece, can't start off every report, can't start off every newscast with that, full disclosure type of thing. But, I think, doing that in a measured way, in an appropriate way, is important to, so that the audience looks and says, yes, they know where they're at, and they're not sitting on this, in this high tower, just spewing down to us what they think is right and what they think we should know. But they actually have a thoughtful, measured approach in reporting with accuracy and thoroughness.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. One thing I thought was interesting about those two examples Jim brought up is the timing of them too. You'll notice NBC News, one of its chief competitors is CBS News, and CBS News just hired Barry Weiss as the new editor-in-chief, and she's coming in there and making some pretty dramatic changes. I think we'll end up making some pretty dramatic changes. It seems she's made a couple small changes in her first few weeks there, but I think that's another way too that, the media is self-correcting or resetting itself, is changes in leadership. And I think there'll probably be some more of that going forward. I don't know that ABC News and NBC News will follow suit exactly that way. And I think it'll also depend on the outcome of any future elections as well. I think partly what happened at CBS News is a reaction to the last presidential election. And so if that were to, depends on what happens in 2028, that'll probably dictate how these media companies make personnel, leadership changes.
And even the midterms coming up next year. I
The
think
midterms will be a bellwether, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, I think there's so many factors here that I'm glad we're able to have a further discussion on this and talk about these issues. And I think, again, it's I kind of like the buyer beware, I think, is kind of what we're saying. I don't want people to come from a place of fear with this. I always say you have that progression from logic to concern to worry, then to fear, then over here you have terror and panic. I think we're at the point of logic, of what we see, and being able to be rational consumers and know that emotion is going to enter into the way that we view a story. As we're able to recognize those emotions, whether it's fear, mistrust, betrayal, failure, shame, so many emotions that we don't even think enter into the equation of what our outcome is, even in how we see the news. I think it's important to see that and see those as factors that affect our ability to perceive, and how does that affect accuracy in that. So stay to the point of logic and concern. Make sure that you're helping your kids to understand how to be a purveyor of the news and a consumer of the news, not just somebody who becomes a glutton of the news that may or may not be accurate, because there's always going to be plenty out there. There are a lot of opinions on how to run the news, the new news organizations and all that. So just be careful of how you are helping your kids to operate in this world and how you're doing it yourself, because you as a parent are exemplary. You as a producer of news out there, and the reporters and the cameramen and the directors, you're all responsible for how we move forward in this world. And to me, to take responsibility for the past, as we're talking, and move forward with providing solutions for a solid future is a great start. The future has yet to tell how things actually move forward from here. And that's, to me, where the power lies, and how we move forward in the future in this.
Yep. Interesting point, Dr. E, and a great conversation. Jim, thank you for coming back with us today for part 2.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and I appreciate you guys giving the time to discuss these important issues. And Andrew, your perspective and insights are always absolutely wonderful. And Dr. E, bringing it all together at the end and sharing how we can all learn from this discussion, as well as how we can apply these learnings to improve our daily lives. That's really valuable, I think. So I appreciate being part of this discussion.
Thanks for the props as always, Jim. Appreciate it. So.
Absolutely. And before you wrap it up, Dr. E, I'll say maybe you never can rule out a part 3 with Jim Proeller returning one more time. I think people can't get enough of Jim. So
absolutely.
Who knows? That's all I'm saying.
All right. Well, until next time.
Questions, we'll all take a stand. If we rebuild trust, it starts with me and you, with questions, accountability, and a newsroom that's true.